Threatened by an outsider in his habitat, the grizzly attacks.
Since its inception, Yellowstone National Park has recorded a total of 10 deaths from animal attacks. 7 of those came from grizzly bears alone. Yet, the park still draws over 4 million visitors every year, and it's not hard to understand why. Yellowstone looks so beautiful, it feels almost unreal. But just like beauty can be deceiving, Yellowstone can turn wild in an instant. These are 6 of the most disturbing animal attacks in Yellowstone National Park's history. Number 6. Woman dragged from tent and eaten. In 1984, the United States welcomed a number of new faces. One of those was a family from Switzerland. 25-year-old Brigitte Fredenhagen traveled with her brother and sister-in-law for a long-awaited family vacation. Brigitte, in particular, had a deep passion for nature and wildlife, and there was no better place to explore than Yellowstone National Park. In the early days of their visit, they toured iconic sites like the Norris Geyser Basin, soaking in the sheer power and beauty of nature. But Brigitte had one dream above all: to see Yellowstone's legendary bears in their natural habitat. So she obtained a permit for Backcountry Campsite 5B1, located deep within the Pelican Valley, one of the park's most remote and bear-dense regions. Before long, evening fell, and the trio began planning the next day's adventure. Brigitte wanted to hike solo to the camp, while her brother and sister-in-law were more interested in exploring other parts of the park. The plan was simple. They would hike 6 miles together to the Astringent Creek Bridge, say their goodbyes, and Brigitte would continue alone to her campsite. After spending one night there, they'd all meet up 2 days later near the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. A near-perfect plan, at least on paper. The next morning, they set off and hiked to the bridge. After hugs and farewells, Brigitte was on her own, energized by the solitude and the untouched wilderness that lay ahead. She was well prepared, aware of the risks, and took precautions. One of them was tying bear bells to her backpack to create noise along the trail. As she passed near White Lake, fatigue began to set in. Just ahead was Campsite 5W1, an unoccupied site near the Astringent Creek drainage at the lake's southern edge. It was only a few miles short of her intended stop, but she decided to rest there for the night, a decision that would prove fatal. Brigitte set up her tent that evening, cooked dinner, and followed all regulations by stringing her food between 2 trees. With little else to do, she went to bed early. Brigitte was just a few hours away from realizing her dream, and that thought filled her mind as she drifted off to sleep. The isolation of White Lake wrapped around her like a blanket, and soon the campsite fell silent. But during the night, a grizzly bear, likely drawn by lingering food odors, entered the area. With a single powerful swipe, it tore through the right side of Brigitte's tent, clamped its jaws around her head, and dragged her from her sleeping bag, crushing her jawbone in the process. Brigitte screamed and struggled, but no one was there to help. The bear vanished into the darkness with her in its grip. By 3:30 p.m. the next day, her brother and sister-in-law grew anxious when she didn't arrive at their meeting point. They rushed to the Fishing Bridge Visitor Center and reported her missing. Rangers issued a search alert by that evening. Those familiar with the rugged Pelican Valley terrain began the grim task of tracking signs of disturbance. They followed drag marks, blood trails, and shreds of torn fabric until they reached a horrifying scene. Just a little distance from her tent, they found her partially consumed remains. Her arms had been stripped of skin, her left foot was missing, and there was extensive tissue damage across her limbs, torso, and buttocks. Brigitte's ashes were flown back to Switzerland on August 3rd, accompanied by her heartbroken family. What was meant to be a joyful adventure had instead become one of Yellowstone's darkest and most haunting stories. And to this day, the bear responsible was never found or conclusively identified. Number 5. Couple attacked by mother bear. 25 years after Brigida's incident, Yellowstone faced another tragedy. This time, it was a couple. Brian Matayoshi and his wife, Marilyn, were hiking along the Wapiti Lake Trail, a popular route in Yellowstone's Hayden Valley. They had visited the park several times before, and this marked their 4th trip. This vacation was meant to be special. Brian had recently retired from his job as a pharmacist, and he and Marilyn were enjoying some well-earned time together, far from the stress of everyday life. That morning, around 11 a.m., they were about 1 mile into their hike when they encountered another hiker. He let them borrow his binoculars to spot a grizzly sow and her 2 cubs a good distance away. It was the first time Brian and Marilyn had seen a bear in person during any of their visits, and they were thrilled. They snapped a few photos and continued down the trail, unaware of just how close they were to danger. Roughly 20 minutes later, annoyed by swarming mosquitoes, they decided to turn back. As they retraced their steps, they saw the grizzly family again. But this time, they were much closer. As they moved through thick lodgepole pines and stepped into a grassy clearing, the mother bear spotted them. She began to approach, likely perceiving them as a threat to her cubs. And in that moment, panic took over. Brian shouted, "Run!" and both he and Marilyn took off. But running from a bear is one of the worst things a person can do. It triggers the bear's chase instinct, and no human can outrun a grizzly. The mother grizzly closed the gap fast. She caught up to Brian and tackled him to the ground. Marilyn dove behind a fallen tree and watched in horror as the bear struck Brian again and again. Paralyzed with fear, she stayed hidden, but when she shifted slightly to move the camera she had landed on, the motion caught the bear's attention. The grizzly left Brian and came toward her. Marilyn immediately dropped face down, playing dead. The bear lifted her by the backpack, slammed her to the ground, and waited for a reaction. Marilyn didn't move. After sniffing her over, the bear turned and walked away, disappearing with her cubs into the woods. Marilyn ran to Brian's side and tried to help. She used a jacket to tie a makeshift tourniquet around his badly injured knee. But it was too late. Brian let out one final breath, and then he was gone. A nearby hiker, who happened to be a trauma surgeon, managed to call 911. Marilyn had already tried 21 times but couldn't get a signal. Still, by the time help arrived, Brian had already succumbed to his injuries. He had a large wound on his forehead and severe damage to his leg. His femoral artery had been torn, causing massive bleeding. Park rangers investigated and found that the mother bear had no history of aggression. She wasn't tagged or collared, and the attack appeared defensive. Because of that, officials decided not to euthanize the bear or her young. It was the first fatal bear attack in Yellowstone in 25 years. Experts called it a 1 in 3 million occurrence. But that didn't make it any less tragic for Marilyn, who had watched her husband die just feet away. However, those experts would soon be proven wrong. Number 4. Man eaten by grizzly. A few months later, something unheard of in Yellowstone's history happened. There was another fatal bear attack, just 3 months after the Brian incident. John Wallace was an experienced hiker who had visited Yellowstone many times before. To him, the park was sacred, a place filled with beauty, peace, and adventure. John arrived in Yellowstone in August 2011 and spent his days soaking in the park's stunning scenery. Though park rangers offered him bear safety guidance, he dismissed it, insisting he didn't need it. He even considered himself a grizzly bear expert. On the morning of August 24th, John set out alone on the Mary Mountain Trail, which cuts through Yellowstone's Hayden Valley. The trail is beautiful but remote, spanning about 20 miles through meadows, pine stands, and thick forest. But it's also well known for grizzly bear activity. In fact, the area is closed for months each year because bears come to feed there. By around 7:30 a.m., John was on his way. He passed multiple warning signs about recent bear activity but continued on. After hiking about 5 miles in, he came to a quiet spot. The weather was calm, the trail was empty. He sat down on a log to rest and pulled out a fruit drink from his pack. It must have seemed like a perfect moment of solitude. But not far from where John sat, hidden in the tall grass, lay 2 bison carcasses, remains from the previous winter. They were drawing bears to the area, and one of them, a female grizzly with a cub, was nearby. At some point, John heard movement. He likely assumed it was a bison or elk, but as he stood and looked around, he found himself face to face with a grizzly. The bear didn't run, it moved closer. He tried to scare it off, shouting, waving, but it didn't work. The bear charged, slammed into John and knocked him to the ground. He raised his arms to shield himself, placing one forearm across the bear's face. But it only gave her something to bite. She clamped down on his hand and arm, then tore into his upper body with her claws. When he rolled over to protect his chest, she attacked his back. Once he stopped moving and the bear began feeding on his body. It wasn't until the next morning that someone found him. A young woman and her father were hiking the same trail when she noticed birds circling overhead. As they approached, they saw a plastic bottle with pink liquid on the ground. Then they spotted boots, then legs. His upper body was partly buried under leaves and dirt. Nearby were his lunch container and jacket. They had found John Wallace's remains. Rangers rushed to the scene and found bear tracks around the body. To identify the bear responsible, they set traps in the area. In the following months, several bears were caught and released with tracking collars while DNA tests were underway. Weeks later, a female grizzly and her cub were captured. Tests confirmed she was the same bear seen near both John Wallace's and Brian Matayoshi's fatal attacks. She had previously been spared after Matayoshi's death because that incident was considered defensive. But with 2 deaths in such a short span, officials made a difficult decision. The 250-pound sow was euthanized. Her cubs were taken to the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center in West Yellowstone, where they could be safely kept away from people. Number 3. Yellowstone's first fatal bear attack. In the summer of 1916, Yellowstone National Park was still an untamed wilderness, largely free from the paved roads and modern safety protocols visitors now take for granted. Rangers worked under the U.S. Army's management, tourists were few, and wild animals still roamed freely across the park's vast interior. Frank Welch, a 61-year-old government teamster, was part of a small work crew camped near Turbid Lake, not far from Sylvan Pass on Yellowstone's eastern border. The crew had been assigned to haul hay and oats using horse-drawn wagons. He was an experienced outdoorsman, reportedly quiet, capable and comfortable sleeping outside beneath the stars. That evening, as the crew bedded down, Welch chose to sleep under one of the wagons, rather than inside a tent. There were no fences, no bear spray, and no bear-proof food containers. Garbage and horse feed were left out in the open, which was quite a common practice at the time. Sometime in the dark hours of the early morning, a grizzly bear entered the camp. It had likely been drawn by the scent of food scraps or livestock feed. This particular bear was already notorious among park workers for raiding camps and limping due to a missing pair of toes on one paw. The bear roamed into the sleeping camp and approached the wagon where Welch lay. Without warning, it lunged under the wagon, grabbing Welch by the torso and dragging him out. The attack was violent and swift. Witnesses in the crew awoke to his screams, but were powerless to stop what was happening. By the time the bear let go and fled back, Welch had suffered massive injuries. His chest was crushed, several ribs broken, and one of his lungs had been punctured. Bleeding and in shock, he was rushed by wagon to Lake Hotel, where he was stabilized and then transferred to Fort Yellowstone, the park's military headquarters at the time. Despite the efforts of doctors, Frank Welch died from his wounds on September 11, 1916, just 4 days after the attack. Determined to prevent another fatality, Rangers hatched an extreme plan. They packed a garbage can with meat and dynamite, placing it in a known bear feeding area not far from Turbid Lake. The next night, the bear returned, attracted by the smell of meat. When it began to dig into the barrel, the rangers detonated the charge. Reports at the time said it blew the bear to pieces, breaking nearly every bone in its body. The bear's remains, including the maimed paw with 2 missing toes, confirmed its identity. Old Two Toes was dead. Number 2. Hunters attacked by grizzly bear and cub. On September 14, 2018, a guided elk hunting trip in the Teton Wilderness of Wyoming ended in tragedy. Mark Uptain, a 37-year-old hunting guide and father of 5, was killed by a grizzly bear. His client, Corey Chubon, was also attacked but managed to survive. Mark worked for Martin Outfitters, a guiding company that helped hunters track big game like elk in the wild areas of Wyoming. He was experienced, kind, and well-liked by everyone who knew him. Corey Chubon had flown in from Florida for the elk hunt and had hired Mark as his guide. The day before the attack, on September 13th, Corey shot an elk with a bow and arrow. The shot was good, but the elk ran off into the forest. Since it was getting dark, the 2 men decided to wait until the next morning to follow the trail and recover the animal. On the morning of September 14th, they went back and found the elk not far from where it had been shot. It was untouched and lying in the grass. The men began the process of field dressing the animal. For those of you who aren't familiar, this means removing the insides and cutting it into pieces to carry out of the forest. They placed a can of bear spray and a loaded Glock pistol nearby, but sadly, they didn't keep them within arm's reach. As they worked, they had no idea a female grizzly bear and her young cub were watching. The bears were likely drawn to the strong smell of the elk. Without warning, the mother bear came charging out of the trees and attacked. Corey tried to help. He grabbed the Glock pistol, but he didn't know how to use it. He tried to throw the gun to Mark, but Mark wasn't able to catch it. Corey was also attacked. The bear bit and clawed at him, wounding his arms, legs, and chest. He managed to break free and ran uphill to where the horses were tied. From there, he rode to higher ground to get a cell phone signal and called for help. Rescue crews flew in by helicopter and picked up Corey, and he was immediately taken to St. John's Medical Center in Jackson, Wyoming, where doctors treated his injuries. But Mark was still missing. But it was a bit too late, and the search had to be called off due to darkness. The next morning, rescuers returned and found Mark's body about a few distance uphill from where the elk carcass had been. He had tried to escape but didn't make it far. It appeared he had been attacked a second time, possibly by both the mother bear and her cub. Number 1. The man who got too close. Our final story takes us back to October 1986. A man named William Bill Tasinski traveled to Yellowstone National Park to take pictures of wildlife. Bill was 38, lived in Great Falls, Montana, and worked as an auto mechanic. In his free time, he loved taking photos of animals and spending time in nature. He was not a professional photographer, but he was very passionate about it. William was blind in one eye, so he wanted to soak in the beauty of the world as much as he could. On the morning of October 5, 1986, Bill parked his Chevy Impala at a spot called the Otter Creek Turnout in the Hayden Valley area of Yellowstone. It was a place known for large animals like elk and bears. Bill brought his camera and tripod and walked into the field alone. He took pictures of wildlife he encountered as he went. At some point, he spotted a female grizzly bear weighing around 500 pounds, not too far from where he was standing. The next day, rangers noticed that Bill's car was still parked where he had left it. That was a warning sign. When they began to search the area, they followed a signal from a bear that had a tracking collar. That signal led them to the terrible truth. Bill had been killed by the grizzly. His body was found near his camera and tripod, and the bear was still nearby. This bear, known as Bear Number 59, had not been considered a serious problem before. But now she has killed a person. In Yellowstone, if a bear kills a human, especially in a tourist area, the park is usually forced to remove it for public safety. After the attack, the park launched a full investigation. A team of experts from different government wildlife groups came together to figure out exactly what had gone wrong. They believed that Bill had gotten too close to the bear and that she attacked out of defense, not aggression. Sadly, the film in Bill's camera did not have any photos of the bear. It only had a couple of pictures of bison taken earlier. That means the attack probably happened very quickly before he could take any bear photos. Bill's body was brought back home, and he was buried in Highland Cemetery in Great Falls. Bill wasn't a reckless man. He was just someone who loved animals and photography. But in trying to capture the perfect picture, he got too close. And nature responded the only way it knows how. These stories aren't meant to frighten or assign blame. The bears in these stories weren't monsters. They were wild animals reacting in ways that, to them, made sense. But sometimes, in that delicate space where people and wildlife meet, things go terribly wrong. We share these stories to honor those who were lost, and to remind every traveler that if you ever find yourself walking the trails of Yellowstone, admire the beauty, soak in the wonder, but never forget the rules for the safety of everyone. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you've ever had a close encounter in the wild, we would love to hear your story.